The morning started like any other, soft light spilling over the kitchen counter, the kettle sighing its first steam. I'd set my teacup by the laptop, same as I always did when I checked the household bills. A habit, quiet and harmless, but that day, the numbers didn't hum their usual rhythm. They skipped: a $42 transfer, then another $118, then a line that made my stomach tighten, a name I didn't recognize, another transfer, another name. My husband used to call me the human calculator. I'd balanced our books for 40 years without a penny missing its place. But as I scrolled, the dates lined up like breadcrumbs, each leading away from the home we'd built. When I asked my son last month about a payment, he'd laughed it off. Just business, Mom, you don't have to worry. But now I could see business had taken a path that led straight through trust. The house was quiet, except for the modem's hum, the kind that sounds like breathing when no one else is home. My hands shook as I clicked the next page and found where the money had really gone. Today I want to tell you something I never thought I'd have to say out loud: how trust can vanish in a scroll, and how dignity can still find its way back. If you've ever shared an account, signed your name on a joint paper, or trusted family with something precious, this story is for you. It's not about greed. It's about what happens when love and responsibility trade places. If these stories matter to you, would you tap that little heart or hit subscribe? Not for me, but so someone else, sitting with their tea and their confusion, might hear this before it's too late. Because the truth is, money doesn't just move on a screen, it moves through families, through promises, through memory. Stay with me. I'll tell you how a single spreadsheet led to a decision that changed everything. The kettle sang on, the stove and the morning light came in thin and sure, the way it always had in our kitchen. I put my teacup down beside the laptop and smoothed the ledger on the table, the notebook my husband had kept for decades with inked columns and patient numbers. We paid the bills together on Fridays. It was a ritual. He would call, my son would come by, we would sort envelopes, compare receipts, and the town would keep its ordinary order. There is a comfort in routine. The modem blinked in the corner like a slow, patient eye. Outside, someone hung a line of laundry. The neighbor's radio carried a far-off hymn. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and warm bread. I liked the way numbers looked when they were balanced, the way a closed column can steady a heart. Over time, I had taught my son how to check a check, how to double-check a number, how to not let emotion decide where a dollar should go. He learned to sit at this table and learn the language of paper. He earned my trust with small, responsible things: calling in a repair, bringing home an extra bag of corn for the freezer, remembering to oil the gate hinges in October. Those acts built a quiet scaffolding of reliance. So when I opened the online account that morning, it felt no different than any Friday. I expected the familiar list: mortgage, utilities, insurance. Instead, I saw a line that didn't fit, a small transfer, a name I didn't know, a date that matched the week my grandson had been here. The numbers on the screen rearranged the room. A stitch in the familiar pattern had loosened. I printed the page and set it beside the ledger, ink beside pixels, paper beside glass. The house kept humming. My hands felt sudden and foreign, as if I were learning to do arithmetic with new fingers. I told myself there must be an explanation. I told myself that people make clerical mistakes. I told myself that the man I raised would not betray us without a reason. I sat back in my chair and tried to remember the exact moment my son first started handling the accounts. He was careful then, steady. I can recall that summer when he learned to balance the flower stalls, small receipts, at 15, counting with the same patience he uses to untangle a fishing line. He used to come over after work and we would do sums together, him asking about the columns, me showing him how to cross-check a receipt with a ledger note. Those afternoons built trust the way mortar builds walls. Trust is a fragile architecture. It relies on seeing the scaffolding. When we hide scaffolds behind curtains, the house can look fine from the street but be hollow inside. I thought of that while I sat with the screen and the paper. The transfer wasn't a hurricane. It was a series of small storms laid quietly. I read each line as if it were a sentence in a story I didn't know. A pattern formed, little amounts, timed regularly, not enough, on their own, to cause alarm, enough, together, to make my chest taut. I made notes in the margin of the printed page, dates, names. My pen moved with a steady hand even as my chest felt tight. I called the bank support line and spoke to a woman who read me the transfers. Her voice had that gentle corporate cadence that makes everything feel official and remote. She told me which accounts they withdrew from and where the funds landed. Hearing the destinations read aloud made the numbers heavier, like coins placed slowly onto a table. After I hung up, I walked to the window and watched the day go on. A dog barked 2 houses over and a child rode a bicycle, hair windblown and unconcerned. Life continued with ordinary smallness. I held the printout like a map that led me to a place I had not planned to visit. The ledger, patient as always, seemed to watch me from the table as if to ask, "What's next?" I didn't know, but I knew I would not let this quiet erosion go unanswered. I made a cup of tea and left it cooling on the table. Hands that used to be quick with a wrench were steady again as I turned the pages of the printout. I thought of my husband and how he would say, "Numbers tell the truth if you listen." I listened, and the pattern kept speaking. Each small transfer was a footstep I had not heard until it was almost at the door. I folded the paper carefully and set it beside the ledger, as if setting 2 witnesses in a room might make them tell the same story. A small transfer from our account to a name I didn't know made my chest go cold. I was raised in a house where numbers were honored like names. My father kept a ledger on a shelf and taught me the patient art of balance. Credit, debit, the slow arithmetic of keeping a household honest. My mother folded receipts and mended shirts with the same careful hands. They believed that promises had weight and that a signature without meaning was like a cup without tea, empty and sad. Young and newly married, my husband and I learned to build conservatively. We bought only what we could afford, paid the mortgage on schedule, and kept a small rainy day jar under the sink. We celebrated in small ways, a pie for a promotion, a repaired fence for a saved penny. We kept our papers in order because it felt like respect for the work of living. When our son arrived, we taught him the same things. He helped balance the grocery lists and learned to write checks with steady letters. There were afternoons of adding receipts at the kitchen table, of showing him how a ledger will tell you a truth if you listen. Money, in our family, was a shared story: who earned, who saved, who lent, and how we repaid kindness with care. Those lessons made me suspicious of shiny promises. I learned to test a sudden request for money the way I tested a rolling pin for steady wood, by touch. When people said, "Trust me," I wanted to see the numbers on paper. That was not mistrust, it was stewardship. My husband would say, "If you can't explain it on paper, it probably isn't worth the trouble." We wore that rule like a small badge of honor. There were moments I was proud of him. He mowed Mr. Hale's lawn without being asked, lent tools and returned them clean, and once walked an elderly neighbor to the bus stop when the weather turned sour. Those acts are small ledgers of their own. They taught me that character shows in what you do when no one watches. I had watched him fold those small acts into a larger kindness and thought the world would be kind in return. People change for reasons, both noble and frightening. I remember the first time I heard about a business venture he was excited about. His eyes lit up, and I could see him balancing the dream with the numbers in his head. We talked late into the night about profit margins and the cost of pride. At the time I believed his thoroughness. I encouraged him because his care then matched the care of his youth. Later, when he took responsibility for more of our household affairs, it seemed a natural shift. He managed our online passwords with confidence and said he'd make bill paying simpler. I trusted him because trust had been built with small things. Giving him keys and codes was, at the time, a way of saying, "I believe in you." It never occurred to me that those keys might one day open doors I would wish kept closed. Still, the image of my father's ink-stained fingers at a ledger keeps me honest. There is a dignity in keeping count, a story of where you have been and how you arrived. I learned that keeping a record is a way of honoring nearly invisible labor, laundry, meals, evenings spent listening to a child practice skills. When numbers vanish into unexplained transfers, the invisible work is at risk of being erased. I kept those lessons close as if they were a small lamp in a storm, so when I sat with the screen and the transfers, I did not feel foolish to ask the hard questions. I thought of my husband saying, "Numbers don't lie, but people can bend them if you don't watch." I picked up the phone and called a friend who had known our family for 40 years. She reminded me of the summer loans and the times we helped others without expecting receipts. But she also said, "Evelyn, keep your papers, protect what's yours." I remembered showing my son how to write numbers that didn't lie, and I wondered which numbers he'd chosen to hide. We built a life of small holidays and steady wages, of fences painted the same color every summer, and of pies on birthdays. The house was an accumulation of modest choices and quiet sacrifices. For years, we kept what needed keeping and let the rest go. My husband worked with calloused hands and a mind for repair. I kept the books and the roses trimmed. We thought there was a safety in the predictability of small tasks. In the later years, our son moved back to town to help us, as the house felt heavier with time. At first it was a comfort. He would come by with tools and fix the storm drains. He would bring a casserole after a long day and sit and talk while I folded napkins with the same care I had taught him. It felt right. But help can turn into management when the lines are not drawn. It happens like a slow tide. No single wave is the disaster, but the water rises, and with it other people's habits of A password changed for convenience becomes a door left unlocked. A mailbox rerouted to be safe becomes a silence where letters used to arrive. Little freedoms slip away when someone else feels the burden of making choices on your behalf. Noticed small shifts. The envelopes were not always forwarded. Appointments were rescheduled without calling me, and I began to be surprised by new labels on boxes in the attic. One day I opened a drawer for a recipe card and found it labeled with a date and a note I didn't understand. I asked about it and received a swift, practical answer that left me uneasy. It was easiest for everyone if decisions were made quickly, and the quickest path often bypassed me. These are not dramatic betrayals. They are the slow rearrangement of a life. You say yes to save a moment, and then there are no moments left for you. It is a dry kind of erasure that happens with polite voices and helpful hands. I began to keep my own small list of things to watch: appointment dates, checkbook entries, odd receipts. I remember feeling a strange mix of shame and clarity. Shame that I had let things slide without asking the hard question. Clarity that once you see a gap, you cannot unsee it. My son had never seemed the type to take advantage. He had held jobs and neighbors trusted him. And yet, trust can be stretched thin by tiredness, by bills that arrive like storms, and by decisions made under pressure. I began to ask more questions at dinner. Who changed the routing on the water bill? I would ask, why did the lawn service show up twice last month? My questions were small at first, spoken between bites. Sometimes I received patient answers and an explanation that made sense. Sometimes I felt a quickness in the reply, a tone that asked me not to pursue. That quickness is the sound excuses make when they want to be smooth rather than honest. I took to checking the attic each week, pulling down boxes with labels I'd written and folders I'd never thought to index. I started a new folder labeled House Records and put the receipts I found inside it. I tucked a note to myself in the front: keep these, ask about oddities. My handwriting felt purposeful, a small act of reclaiming what belonged to me. Then one afternoon I opened the folder and noticed a receipt missing. It matched an odd withdrawal and a transfer that, on its own, seemed insignificant but in pattern was telling. A missing receipt, like a missing stitch in a quilt, tells you that the pattern has been altered. For the first time I realized this quiet fault line was not just an idea. It was real and present in our paper and our life. One missing receipt in the folder showed a payment that no one could explain. There was a kind of small dignity to how we did things. We balanced receipts with a practiced calm. So when the transfer history on my laptop began to look like a roadmap to places I didn't know, something inside me folded in. The transfers were not big. That's what made them dangerous. Small sums move like a soft rain. Each one alone is hardly noticed. Together, you end up with a flood, quietly finding a path. I sat at the table, the kettle long since forgotten, and scrolled. I counted out loud the way people do when the numbers are heavy. $42 here, $118 there, $56 on a Tuesday. They were regular, they were neat. The transfers went to an account labeled with his business name and sometimes to another name. I had seen in church years ago a man who'd done odd jobs, the sort of fellow people hire and forget. When I asked him casually that night, trying to keep my voice level, he gave me that easy smile and said, "It's just business, Mom, don't worry." He said it like a blanket you lay over a mess and hope no one looks under. His hands were steady as he rinsed a dish. The house smelled of lemon and dish soap. The ordinary things went on as if nothing had shifted. But the phrase closed like a door. Just business is a phrase meant to keep hearts from roving. It isolates numbers from people. It treats stewardship of money as separate from stewardship of family. I felt suddenly both foolish and very awake. foolish that I'd let routines become habits that need watching, awake to the fact that patterns can tell you what people will not. That night, I printed every line of the transfer history and laid it on the table like a map. Paper has a weight that screens don't. It made each small number feel like a footprint. I circled dates, wrote notes in the margin, and stared until the kitchen blurred. I could have marched into a confrontation, slamming papers and speech like doors. Instead, I took a breath and did what my husband taught me to do when storms looked near. Gather facts, steady yourself, and do what care requires. There would be a time for anger if anger was needed, but first there would be a time for proof. The choice between asking and accusing is the hard shape of most family troubles. If you accuse too quickly, you risk breaking the thing you love. If you delay too long, the harm grows in silence. I thought of that balance while I made copies and noted times. The kettle whistled the next morning, as if nothing had happened. I made a small plan: verify the transfers, look for receipts, and print everything I could. I would ask hard questions gently. I would try not to turn a quiet mistake into a public wound without reasons. There is dignity in being careful before you speak. Still, when I laid the printed pages beneath the lamplight and looked at the neat rows of numbers and names, I felt the same small electric prickle you feel when you notice a hairline crack in a treasured vase. It does not mean the vase will fall, but it means the vase is vulnerable. I reached for the phone, the paper trembling a little under my fingers. I would call the bank in the morning. I would also call a friend who'd been our accountant's assistant for years. I wanted more eyes on it before the house started to hum with rumors. That night I printed every line of the transfer history and laid it on the table. The next days were a kind of careful work that felt like dusting around a hidden mole. I sorted bank statements the way I had sorted photographs, by date, by name, by the small marks that let you know who held a thing last. I unfolded canceled checks and checked the names against my ledger. I called the small hardware store where my son had sometimes bought supplies and asked politely about invoice numbers. They were helpful, the way neighbors can be. He noticed me looking. At first he was casual about it, a shrug and a "don't worry, Ma," the same words people use to keep weather from becoming a forecast. But there was an edge to his voice that I hadn't heard before. "I'm handling it, Mom," he'd say, eyes down. Handling is a word people use when they do things for you they think you cannot manage. It can feel kind, and it can feel like control. Word goes fast in our town, but it goes faster when you make it go. A neighbor who used to borrow jars of sugar came by with a casserole and sat for a while. She spoke carefully, with the voice of someone who had watched a family for 3 generations. "Are you all right?" she asked. I answered with a small smile, because sometimes you keep the house from rattling by holding your hand steady. People started offering advice. "Maybe you should let him manage more," one woman said in the church parking lot, fingers folded over her purse. "It's hard these days." Another friend suggested we get someone to help us with online banking. The tone was helpful, but the undercurrent felt like caution. People who once assumed our reputation now had questions. The bank sent a notice in the mail. Routine, official, asking for clarification on an outgoing transfer. I kept it flat on the table as if seeing it would make it less jarring. The notice said nothing accusatory. It asked for documentation. The request itself felt like a legal, polite knock at a door. You cannot ignore an official envelope like you can ignore a neighbor's hush. I called and set up an appointment with the bank manager. I took my printed transfer history and my ledger to the branch. The manager was patient, explaining what the flags meant in a way I could follow. The small sums could be explained with invoices, she said. Patterns were the thing that worried her. $100 here, 50 there, over months, that can add up, she said, looking kindly over her glasses. At home, conversations grew tight. My son answered quickly if I asked about a certain merchant and then shifted. He would say, "Oh, that was for a subcontractor," or "I bought something for work." The answers were not false, just incomplete. Incomplete answers leave the listener to fill in the rest. And the most frightening thing you can be asked to supply is the worst-case motive. In the middle of all this, a neighbor mentioned she'd heard a late phone call the week before, a man's voice and an urgent tone. It made me look at dates again. Small towns notice the small things. They notice what people buy, who comes around after dark, and which faces suddenly looked tired. I felt squeezed by 2 things: the need for proof and the desire not to break what might still be mended. Some people advised being discreet. Others said, frankly, protect yourself first. It was lonely work, keeping lists, cross-checking, calling suppliers. It was also the work of someone who loved enough to look carefully. A bank notice arrived in the mail, asking for immediate clarification on an outgoing transfer. Paperwork is antiseptic until someone you love uses it to tell half-truths. One afternoon, I opened an email from the tax office that made the floor tilt under me. A withholding form had my social security number and an employer I'd never worked for attached to it. It was the kind of clerical oddity that could be called a mistake, except it wasn't alone. Utility bills had been rerouted to a different account in a way that made paying the water and the electricity look like someone else had been in charge. The phone company sent a notice to an address we hadn't used in 3 years. Little things stacked into a pile that made my whole shoulder ache. When I followed a line of transfers labeled consulting, I found amounts that matched up to restaurant charges, a set of tools bought in a month when our yard was hardly used, and a hotel booking that had nothing to do with our needs. Consulting had become a kind of catch-all label for money that didn't need a real reason if someone decided it didn't. A scary kind of bookkeeping. It disguises the purpose under a respectable name. Friends who had always been practical suggested a lawyer. It's not about drama, said Ruth from church, pressing a hand to my arm. It's about protection. We're not accusing, we're being sensible. Legal words sound heavy when your house has been quiet for years. A lawyer opens a book and writes terms that stand up in court. It felt so far from the warm, soft conversations I'd had over pies and cold weather. Still, some of the moves could be explained away: an advance for a project, a misplaced invoice. But the worry is never a single paper. It's the pattern. The week your grandson stayed over, certain entries line up. The week contractors came for a roof estimate. There are small withdrawals at odd hours. Patterns tell stories, even when people try to tell them differently. I started sending myself copies of the statements by certified mail, so I would have timestamps that couldn't be questioned. I made lists that were neat and careful. There is a kind of armor in a careful list. It steadies your voice when you have to speak to people who will not be gentle. When I asked my son about a hotel charge, he flinched and said it was for a client. When I asked about a set of tool purchases, he said it was in case he needed to work on a project. The answers were possible. They were also not the whole picture. A truthful account includes details rather than the phrase, "It's just business." Details are the difference between a cool, plausible answer and a full explanation. The bank manager and the lawyer, I consulted both, said the same thing in different words. Documentation, paperwork, doesn't just record numbers, the lawyer said when I brought him the folder. It records choices made in shadow, as you put it, or choices made in the light. Either way, the paper tells us, which that night I dreamed of doors that opened only halfway, of rooms where lamps had been turned down, and the dust left undiscovered. When I woke, the ledger on the table looked like a map with places I had never planned to travel. When I opened a spreadsheet, I saw a string of transfers timed the week my grandson stayed over. When a parent confronts a child about money, the room gets small in a way I never expected. I tried to choose my words like a seamstress chooses thread, careful, purposeful, trying not to tear the cloth. There are transfers I don't understand, I said, placing the printed list between us. I watched the light catch his face. He looked younger than his age when he was surprised. At first he was quiet. There was a thinness in his jaw. Then a defensiveness rose like heat. "It's business, Mom," he said again, a little sharper this time. I could hear the word as a slammed drawer. "I'm trying to keep things going." His voice wavered and then hardened. He accused the bank's online interface of being confusing. He said, "I'll fix it. Give me time." Time is sometimes a mercy. Time is also sometimes a way to let a wound fester. I felt both things at once. I wanted to believe in him, in the boy who learned to add sums at our table, and in the man who mowed the neighbor's lawn out of habit. I also had the papers. The papers don't take your voice. They take your numbers. Other family members gathered like weather. My daughter offered practical suggestions and a steady hand. My sister, who lives an hour away, asked me not to make it a public fuss. "Keep it private," she said, pulling me to a smaller space. "We must not shame him." Shame is a complicated currency. It can correct, but it can also collapse someone further underweight. Then, a name from the past surfaced in the transfer list. A former business partner my son had mentioned years ago. A man who had left town owing small debts and apologies. The name made me look twice. People who owe once sometimes ask for help again. People who owe a second time sometimes have learned to ask for help in ways that look like patterns. A longtime neighbor remembered a loan taken in a bad year and said in a voice as soft as old curtains, "You know, There were times your husband helped him out. Suddenly, it wasn't just about my son. The history of favors and the way they entangle across decades was part of the story. The ledger was a history not only of money but of relationships. And those relationships have their own obligations and blind spots. I wanted to ask him something a mother always wants to ask a child in trouble but rarely does. Are you hurting, or are you hiding? Both questions need different answers. Hurt invites help. Hiding asks for accountability. That night he left the house in a hurry, the front door clicking in a sound that felt like a punctuation mark. He was gone until dawn. The house slept without him and made a small, honest noise as if to say, "We notice absence." Neighbors began to take sides quietly. Some offered errands and casseroles. Some looked the other way. It's amazing how softly fracture sounds, like a curtain moved by a breeze. I stood in the doorway and felt the weight of the papers in my hand and the shape of the sun I had raised shifting before me. I wanted to gather him in the old way, with a bowl of soup and a patient ear, but I also knew that some things require a steadier hand. He left the house that night and didn't come back until dawn. The morning the bank called to warn about a possible freeze, it felt like the world had shifted into a practical frame. Systems do not have kindness built into them. They require forms, dates, and signatures. They speak in a language made of deadlines. The woman at the bank was polite and precise. "We'll need authorization to proceed with a review," she said. "If you want to protect household funds, we recommend freezing transfers until the audit completes." Freezing an account sounds simple in conversation, but like a small domestic earthquake in practice. It would mean we could not pay a contractor scheduled for the roof repair. It could mean a delay in a prescription refill. It would mean signaling to the world that something was suspect in our household. The decision was a ledger itself, weighing costs, consequences, and the risk to a family's reputation. I called everyone I thought might help: the lawyer, a trusted friend who had been our accountant, and my daughter. We tried to think through the scenarios. If something is wrong, the lawyer said, you have a duty to protect assets. If there's a misunderstanding, you can unfreeze after explanation. Duty is an odd word for something that sits at your kitchen table. It feels formal in a house that has always smelled of biscuits and used tea towels. We called a family meeting. The room was small. The papers on the table made the place feel serious in a way I didn't like. My son looked tired, thinner perhaps from nights I had not known. He explained, in a voice that wanted to sound bluntly practical, that some transfers had been emergency measures for cash flow, that partners had leveraged lines of credit, and that he'd hoped to cover it. He was careful with his words, perhaps too careful. Careful words can be a way of keeping the truth soft. "What if we pause transfers until we sort this?" my daughter suggested quietly. She balanced the empathetic heart with the practical head in a way that made me proud. "We need to know what's household money and what's business money." There was a long silence. I thought of the money we'd used to repair the fence last spring, of the grocery lists and the birthday pies. I thought of the smallness of our needs. I thought of the loudness of an account freeze and the slow diplomacy of a family caught on an administrative ledge. At last I spoke, in the voice I had used when the children were small and one of them had cut the crust off a sandwich without asking. "We protect the house first," I said. "We balance need with care. If someone made a choice, they must explain it. We'll do what we must to keep the ordinary life going." That was the moment the bank lady had expected. She set up the process and told me what paperwork we'd need to start a temporary review. It meant trips to the bank, stacks of invoices, and a clearer separation of accounts. It meant inviting a witness to the meetings and a small formality that would make our private life legible to systems. Then my son said something that stung. "You don't trust me." The words were small and ancient. They are the kind of words that can splinter a family when they are left to hang in a room. Systems don't care for family stories. They need signatures, dates, and facts. Sometimes a truth arrives, not like thunder, but like a neighbor bringing a casserole quietly, with too much information wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Talbot, who'd known our family for 30 years, stopped me at the post office, with a folded receipt in her hand and a sheepish look. She'd been clearing out a box of old invoices for the town hall and found something that led her to make a call. "Evelyn," she said in that soft voice, "there are names on here I think you ought to see." She handed me a photocopy that made my stomach dip. One name matched a man who had once borrowed heavily from my husband and never seemed to make good on it. Another name was an old business partner of my son's. Someone who had years ago promised returns and then disappeared when things went wrong. The transfers on my printout matched up with invoices that, on the surface, looked legitimate: consulting fees, subcontractor pay, emergency liquidity transfers, but the invoices had been issued in the names of people I trusted, and some I did not. It became clearer why my son kept saying, "It's business." He'd tangled himself in promises to other people, promises he thought he could keep quietly, by drawing on household funds as a bridge. The motive was not simple greed. It was a web of favors and fear. Partners on the brink asking for bailouts, a bankrupt supplier needing a hand, a payroll that could not wait. When you love someone, you sometimes stretch to hold others up, but stretching household money to meet other people's obligations is dangerous, and in our case, unsanctioned. Hearing the reason softened my anger in a way that made the problem sharper. Empathy made it harder to plainly name wrongdoing. If he'd been trying to cover payroll for a small crew he was responsible for, that is different from siphoning funds for a lavish weekend. Both are wrong to do without consent, but one is desperation and one is opportunity. The law circles the action. The family must decide how hard to be with a son who may have been trying to protect others while risking his mother's security. There is a particular kind of ache when you see the human reasons behind a ledger. I remembered nights when lenders called my husband and we covered a hole with a small payment because a baby needed medicine or a neighbor had no coal. We did that with conversation and clear understanding. This felt like the old kindness twisted into shadows, help without asking, decisions made where I would not see them. We called the accountant who'd been our friend for years. She looked at the documents and folded her hands. "This is not the sort of bookkeeping you do in the margins," she said. "It's intentional, or at least it has intention behind it." That word intentional is heavy. It implies choice. It implies responsibility. The stakes were higher now. Legal clarity to satisfy the bank, reputational clarity so the neighbors stop whispering, and moral clarity so my son could either own what he did or accept help to make it right. My plan to gather evidence became less an exercise in accusation and more an act of protection. We had to protect the house, but we also had to protect the man who'd once held my hand in the dark. Knowing why he did it didn't make the ledger less true. It made the consequences harder to weigh. Plans are small scaffolds you place when a house needs mending. I wrote one on a yellow legal pad with steady letters: temporary account review, joint restitution schedule if wrongful transfers were verified, a separate account for household needs, a 3-month reassessment. I called the lawyer and the accountant, and I asked both to attend a family meeting as neutral witnesses. I knew the plan felt formal. I knew it would bruise. Formality can feel like mistrust. But formality also leaves a paper trail, and that trail protects the small things that feed daily life: the electricity, the meds, the heating oil. I offered help to my son, not punishment. "If you need counseling for finances," I said aloud, "we'll help you find it. We will not cast you out. But we cannot let the house be a secret ATM." The first cost was immediate. My son looked at the sheet and said with a voice so small my heart hurt, "You don't trust me." He was right. The plan was built on that fact. But I had to answer for a larger trust, the trust of the family, the community, and the life my husband and I had kept together. Trust is communal, not private. It includes the whole, not just one piece. Neighbors began to notice the change in tone at family gatherings. Some came with casseroles and words of support. Others kept a polite distance, as if the unspoken ledger made them uneasy. My daughter texted late that night, "Are you sure? This will change everything." She had the instinct to preserve peace. I had the instinct to preserve the house. There is a cost to asking for clarity. People will sometimes call it cold. They will say, "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," or "family should stick together." Those are easy phrases when you are not the person who finds unfamiliar names on account statements. I accepted the short-term pain because the alternative was a slow erosion of dignity. We set a date for the family meeting, and I called the mediator from the church to sit with us and keep things civil. I wanted signatures on the temporary terms, so we would not be left with only good intentions and no means of accountability. Paper, I thought, is a way of translating love into action. It's not vindictive, it's practical. That evening, as I turned the light down and folded my legal pad away, I felt both exhausted and oddly steady. Taking practical steps felt like taking a small, sturdy stitch in a garment that risked unraveling. There would be fallout. Some friends would be upset. Some family ties would strain. But I have always kept our home as a place where promises are honored with attention and paper. I would not abandon that principle because it made things harder for a night. That night my daughter texted, Are you sure? This will change everything. When a private ledger suddenly needs public witnesses, the town begins to feel like it's peering through a window. People are kind in ways that sometimes cut deeper than bluntness. Mrs. Pritchard from the quilting circle dropped off lemon bars and said, "We'll pray for you, Evie. Prayer is a warm thing, and I appreciated it." But then Mrs. Pritchard added, in a lower voice, "You always said transparency was best." That was praise and a question together. The sons-in-laws called with cautious sympathy. "It's family," they said. "We've been there." Their calls were a soft net, trying to hold things together without asking anything too sharp. Another neighbor, who runs the diner, mentioned in a passing way that folks at the counter had opinions. "People worry," he said. "They want to know if everything's all right with the hearts." Then someone reposted a rumor on the neighborhood FB group. It started as a question. "Anyone know if the hearts are okay?" and quickly turned into speculation. The digital town square has teeth. Words reach ears that otherwise would never notice a subtle change. In a way, the whole situation felt like a weather pattern. Some breezes in support, some gusts of judgment. The church offered mediation. Reverend Moore is a gentle man with a steady voice. He felt like a safe place to air things. He agreed to host a meeting and to ask a neutral mediator to come. We set a date. I felt comforted and anxious in equal measure. Public mediation is a kind of airing that makes everyone take off their gloves. It can be corrective. It can also be painful. I also felt a strain from within the family. My sister sent a long letter reminding me of the value of forgiveness and the cost of scandal. My daughter sat with me at the table and said, "Ma, whether he did it for a noble reason or not, this is hurting you." Those words landed with a kind of care that only a child can offer a parent. My son sent messages that were alternately brief and pleading. The heat from all sides made my house feel like the center of a compass point that everyone else was reading. People pulled in directions they thought would be best. Cousins advised discretion. Old friends urged transparency. An accountant suggested we make a public statement to stop rumor. Everything felt loud. The mediator sent guidelines. Keep conversation factual. No interruptions. Witnesses present. I made copies of every statement, every invoice, every note I had compiled. I wanted the meeting to be calm and clear. I wanted to show the papers, not only to accuse, but to offer a path back, restitution, counseling, a plan to repair harm. Still, I lay awake that night thinking of the way gossip winds through a small town, and of how easily a mistake becomes reputation. When a household's ledger goes public, the whole town thinks it has a vote. I hoped our process would be honest and merciful, and that the town's curiosity would not become cruelty. Tomorrow the mediator would sit at our table and the town would hold its breath. The house is loud at night when your life is unsettled. Every creak sounds like a question. I walked the rooms and listened to the small sounds, the refrigerator's low motor, the clock on the mantel, the neighbor's dog pacing in the distance. I thought of my husband's voice saying, "Keep your head steady, Evie, and the rest will follow." It used to feel so easy, that steadying. Now it felt like lifting a weight. I pulled old photographs from a drawer and laid them on the bed. There we were, young and foolish looking, and full of plans. My son's small hands in my lap as I taught him to count buttons, his first paycheck folded into an envelope. We had taught him how to be honest with numbers. We had taught him how to set things right. I kept asking myself where that lesson had bent. There are choices you make to preserve things you love. There are other choices you make because you are trying to quiet the storm. I thought of freezing an account. I thought of asking him to move out until things were settled. Both felt brutal and necessary in different measures. The dark brings such harsh clarity. You can see the choices better. But choosing means you must leave other things behind. I wrote a list on a clean sheet of paper. Non-negotiables. Protect medicine and utilities. No unexplained transfers. Joint signatories on household accounts. A 3-month oversight with a trusted accountant. Offer to help him find counseling and a plan to repay any wrongful transfers. Those were my anchors. Writing the list felt like stepping into the person I had long wanted to stay. Steady, practical, unafraid to name what must be named. It felt brave and lonely. I took the paper and folded it into my pocket as if carrying a small talisman would help me be brave in daylight. Fear arrived like tide. The fear of losing my son's warmth, of his resentment, the fear of neighbors whispering, and of simple bills going unpaid because of an account freeze. I thought of the children we had raised, the meals we'd shared, the arguments and repairs. I thought of how many times we had forgiven and helped each other in the soft seasons. And still, The ledger sat at the kitchen table like a patient judge. Numbers do not know how to plead. They simply add up. If the sums showed harm, then the answer could not be to look away. I spent the night making calls before dawn. I called the lawyer, who said calm and practical words about process. I called a friend who had been through a similar thing, and she reminded me that dignity is not the same as silence. She said, "You can love him and still protect what you must." By morning, the house smelled faintly of coffee. The list in my pocket felt heavier and truer. There were terrible choices ahead, but there is a sort of relief that comes from deciding to act. It does not remove the pain, it only makes a path through it. There are nights you trade comfort for clarity, and wake resolved. We sat at the kitchen table under the lamp where we had balanced checkbooks for decades. The mediator sat across from me with a gentle manner and a binder of forms. The lawyer was there, the accountant, my daughter, and my son. It felt like a small court, but it was home. I placed the printed transfer history in front of me and opened the folder. I spoke plainly. I told them I loved my son and always would. I told them I was not looking to punish but to protect. Then I read the list I had written in the dark. Temporary account review, joint signatories, a separate household account, a repayment schedule if we confirmed wrongful transfers, 3 months, and then a reassessment. When I finished, my son's face crumpled. He stood and paced once, then sat, and then, in a voice that was part apology and part explanation, he mentioned calls from partners and from men who were now gone from his life. He admitted some transfers had been to cover a payroll, some to cover a debt he'd inherited from a business partner, and some, he hesitated, were mistakes he'd meant to cover later. The room changed temperature. My daughter reached for his hand. The mediator helped us turn the proposals into terms. We asked for signatures on a memorandum of understanding, a clear paper that said what we would do and when. We agreed to counseling for finances, a commitment to separate household and business accounts, and an understanding that restitution would be organized. He asked if I would press charges. My voice felt small when I said, "No, I want repair. I want accountability." In that moment, I chose a line carefully: accountability with compassion. I was not the law. I was a mother trying to keep a house intact and a son safe from his own collapse. Emotions flared. Someone shouted, then apologized. There were tears and a few words that can never be unspoken. Yet the paper we signed mattered. It made intentions legible. It turned messy human things into a plan with dates and responsibilities. That is not a cure. It is a pathway. I left the meeting with the pages in my hand and a small, careful hope. The house seemed quieter, as if it had held its breath with us. The immediate aftermath would be tests of patience. The next weeks would require follow-through more than sentiment. He stared at the list and whispered, "You don't trust me anymore." We put the papers in the middle of the table like a small altar. The transfer history spread its neat columns beneath the lamp and took up a kind of gravity. The mediator sat with a pad. The lawyer sat with a small, respectful silence. My daughter had a hand on my son's arm, and I felt 30 years of quiet evenings and shared bills pressed gently into the room. I began with facts, because facts are kind in a way anger never is. I read the dates, I read the names, I read the amounts, and the little memo lines that people think are private. On March 12th, an outgoing transfer of $250 to, and I named it. I felt a strange steadiness as I read, like the way you steady a teacup when the hands tremble. My voice did not want to break. There were small sounds, the clock, the page turning, the dish in the sink cooling. My son looked up when I named a weekend hotel charge. His face was a map of explanations that had been rehearsed at 2 in the morning. He swallowed and said, "I thought I could manage it. The men I was helping said it would be repaid. I panicked when they couldn't." It was the kind of confession that is both small and enormous. He spoke like a man who had been carrying a set of plates and realized one had a hairline crack. The banker, who had agreed to attend, explained the patterns plainly. "Small transfers," she said, "can be legitimate, but the pattern here looks like household money used for outside obligations." She explained the risk, creditors, tax exposure, and the way a household budget can be hollowed out by tiny, repeated withdrawals. I listened and I felt the practical truth of what we had always suspected. Systems do not care for intent, they care for documentation. One of the partners named in the ledger came, with a lawyer of his own. He did not deny needing help. He told a short story of his business failing, and of asking for favors. His eyes asked for kindness. My son's voice was quieter then, not defensive but weary. "I was trying to keep someone afloat," he said. I thought I could do it without them knowing. That is the language of a mistake. You think you can carry the whole world in your pocket, and it will not make a whole dot. There were moments when tempers rose. My daughter asked sharply about a specific invoice. Someone slammed a hand on the table in frustration. The mediator reminded us to breathe and to speak slowly. We were not in a courtroom. We were in a kitchen where grandchildren had learned to tie shoes. I thought of all the small lives that depend on how we speak when we are afraid. I pressed for restitution in ways that were neither theatrical nor vengeful. We protect the house first, I said, and the sentence landed like a rule. Arrange a repayment schedule, separate household and business accounts, joint signatories for household funds until we reassess. The banker sketched out how an escrow or temporary oversight could work. The partners offered what little they could: a returned check, a promise of small monthly repayments. It was not dramatic, it was practical, which in its way was more healing. When the visitor signed a document acknowledging the transfers and the plan, tears came into my son's eyes. He put his head in his hands and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you all at risk." His apology was not a cure, but it was the tool of repair. He signed to an affidavit acknowledging the errors and promising to enter counseling and a restitution plan. At that table we made something like a covenant. Not to broadcast failure as gossip, not to let shame become exile, but to make right what had been unmade. We left the room with forms and envelopes, and a kind of weary relief. The concrete gesture, signatures, a scheduled payment plan, a notarized note, did not erase days of worry, but it did create a path forward. For a long moment, no one spoke. The days after the meeting felt like learning a new language. We moved slowly because the stakes were practical and tender. The bank set up a separate household account. My son and I both became signatories, and for the first time in years I watched the notifications come up on my phone and felt the small, steady heartbeat of transparency. We scheduled weekly budget reviews. My daughter volunteered to lead the first one. She brought a large ledger book and a kindness that did not insist on forgiveness. We sat once a week at the same table where we had argued and mended other things in life. The ritual felt like prayer, in a practical dress. We read numbers, we asked questions, we documented invoices, and we left with a plan. Small habits returned with new rules. Before any transfer above a certain amount, someone phoned and asked, "Are we agreed?" The son called before buying tools. He texted receipts. My grandchildren learned that money is spoken of plainly at our house. That honesty replaced the hush that once let things happen in shadow. He began financial counseling. At my suggestion, and with my support, I did not want to punish. I wanted to help him learn tools to manage and to keep his pride intact while he rebuilt. The counselor taught budgeting methods that sounded like math and like mercy. He learned to separate business cash flow from household flow. We all learned patience. Reparation payments came in small, steady sums. They were not dramatic. They were practical, like mortar in a wall. Each payment was marked restitution on the ledger, and we checked them off together. The bank removed the temporary oversight once the first months proved consistent. That felt like a small graduation. Neighbors noticed. Ruth from down the street came over with soup and said, "I like seeing receipts again." She was smiling because she meant the idea of openness in a home. People brought little courtesies, a watchful text, a casserole, an offer to drive for an appointment. The town's tone softened. It takes time for gossip to turn into support. But it does happen when people see honest steps. I reclaimed everyday agency in small ways. I kept my key where I always had it. I checked the mail and opened the envelopes myself. That may sound small, but it mattered to me deeply. I cooked the same soup I always did and left a bowl on the counter with a note for my son. "Let's talk at 6. It was an invitation to ordinary connection. Trust rebuilt slowly. There were missteps, a transfer forgotten, a bill delayed, but our rule became to speak quickly and correct publicly. Shame has less power when the family agrees to transparency. We were not perfect. There were afternoons I felt weary and evenings when old hurts returned, but the work we did was ordinary. Callings, receipts, signatures, kindnesses. We put rules around kindness so kindness wouldn't become a loophole. If there is one thing I want you to walk away with from this modest, hard story, it is that dignity is not loud. It is not a headline. Dignity is a quiet ledger you keep with your life. It means you record, you verify, and then only then you trust. Here are a few practical things we learned that you can take home tonight. First, keep paper. or at least time-stamped digital copies. Print your transfer history periodically. Send statements to yourself by certified mail if you need timestamps. It is not paranoid. It is prudent. I printed pages at the kitchen table because paper is a stubborn witness. Second, set simple rules for household money. A separate household account, joint signatories, and a threshold for transfers that require 2 approvals. Change temptation into conversation. It also protects everyday needs, groceries, prescriptions, utilities from getting mixed with someone else's risk. Third, ask for the receipts and explanations. Gentle scripts help. Try phrases like, "Can you show me the invoice for that?" or "Please, put that in writing so we can note it on the budget." Those phrases are polite and firm. They create the record that systems need and families often forget to keep. Fourth, invite a witness or mediator for big conversations. A neutral person keeps the talk from spiraling into accusation and helps turn promises into plans. We used our church mediator and a trusted accountant. It kept our meeting calm enough to be useful. Fifth, offer help with boundaries, not punishment with no path to repair. We arranged counseling and a repayment schedule rather than laying down a single, irreversible sentence. People who are hurting often need tools, not exile. We built a plan that included both accountability and support. Sixth, keep the rituals. Sunday dinners, weekly budget talks, shared calendars. These small acts make honesty habitual. They teach young people that money is spoken about, not hidden away. They teach families how to hold one another. Dignity is civic as well as personal. It is the American idea of fairness applied to home life. If we can balance a checkbook, we can also balance mercy and responsibility. This is not about lawyering up the neighborhood. It's about everyday decency. If you suspect trouble, ask gently and then insist on paper. If someone you love has made a mistake, offer a path to repair. We weren't perfect. We made errors of judgment and of trust. But we learned practical courage. The courage to name what must be named, to do the small administrative work that love sometimes requires, and to hold family without letting kindness become a blindfold. If you take one thing away, let it be this: a household that agrees to transparency is not a house that loves less. It's a house that loves enough to be honest. After our story quietly settled, messages arrived like small, warm parcels. Mrs. Gilmore from 2 doors down wrote to say she'd started a monthly book night with her daughter, where they went over expenses together with tea and biscuits. A young woman from the next state sent a short note: "Because of you, I asked my brother to put family accounts in writing. A church friend told me she found an old deed in the attic and that it had been signed back into the right name after a conversation I never imagined I'd prompt. People said, often, you made it okay to ask for receipts." That phrase made my eyes sting. There's a shame in families that keeps people from asking practical questions. Making it okay, that's the thing that turned gossip into care. A man wrote that he had apologized to his mother after realizing he'd handled her bills without telling her the whole story. Another neighbor set up a small workshop at the community center about budgeting for multi-generational households. Our quiet, careful steps found their way outward and became something other families could borrow. Perhaps the most moving message was from a woman who said, "Your story gave me the permission to keep my key." It felt like someone returning a small, sacred thing to itself. A message arrived that made my eyes ache with gratitude. Months later, the house smells of lemon and baking again. The chair by the window is still the place I watch the street and the maple my husband planted. The ledger is mostly digital now. I have a small printed line in a drawer, marked in red: "Resolved, restitution complete." I take it out sometimes and fold it into my palm, like a talisman. We keep a calendar on the fridge with a sticker for the monthly budget night. My son calls before making any larger transfer. He texts a receipt for the lawnmower. My daughter emails the monthly summary. It's not dramatic, it's just gentle procedure. The rituals are the same. Tea at noon, the news on the little radio, a phone call to check on an elderly neighbor. Once in a while the chair is empty and I feel the old ache. Then someone comes by with a story or a cup of coffee, and the house fills again. The past isn't erased. It is remembered and kept in a way that doesn't let it do more harm. I keep the resolve line in a small drawer next to my husband's old watch. It reminds me that dignity can be reclaimed with steady acts, not loud triumphs. It reminds me that civility and justice are possible at a kitchen table. The doorbell rang, and I reached for the calendar before the cup. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments which rule you'd add to protect a home, a simple line you'd put on the family table. Please subscribe for more quiet stories that pair heart with common sense. Next time, I'll read letters found in an old mailbox that changed how a whole summer was remembered. Thank you for sitting with me. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to our neighbors, the mediator, and anyone who keeps a ledger with love.